Okay. Well, welcome to everyone. My name is Dr. Nachum Kowalski, and I want to welcome you to the Sleep ASAP webinar. Hopefully, you're one of the many people who's returning to watch us once again to speak with a top-level expert in the area of sleep. Before we start, I would like to introduce Sleep ASAP. Sleep ASAP is a new global sleep management education platform established by an international team of specialists in different fields such as art therapy, music therapy, psychology, and neurology. Now, we've gathered in order to promote awareness and discuss effective and affordable alternate solutions beyond medications for people with sleep issues. So whether you yourself have sleep issues, or you work in the field, or maybe you're a student studying this field, or you just basically want to learn about the topic, this webinar really is for you. Now today, we really do have the honor of being able to host Dr. Peter C. Whybrow on the topic of the brain's clocks, sleep, and the rhythms of the brain. Dr. Wybrow, MD, is a director of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at the University of California, Los Angeles. He was born and educated in England. He's the author of, among other books, A Mood Apart and the award-winning American Mania, When More Is Not Enough. We're going to be talking about a whole range of topics, but before I proceed, I would like to turn to Dr. Whybrow and ask him to introduce himself to our audience.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you.
You're quite right. I'm at the University of California. I migrated here from England years ago, and now I direct what is probably the largest neuroscience and behavior program in the US. And we have all sorts of experts here. I just reflect what I know from those wonderful people who work with me. But my interest has been for a long time. I'm an endocrinologist originally, before I became a psychiatrist. And I've always been interested in bodily rhythms. And of course, many of these rhythms go wrong in serious illnesses like depression and mania, which is the book that you mentioned, A Mood Apart. American Mania was a book published about 7 or 8 years ago, which described some of the difficulties that we have in American society because of our extraordinary fast new world that we've created, which is extremely enticing but also very damaging in terms of our bodily processes and also in terms of the way we think. And most recently, just this week, which I think is how you came to know about me, a new book called The Well-Tuned Brain has just arrived on the stands. I think it's May 14th, its actual publication date. So that is a book that talks about how one can be a little kinder to oneself and understand the way the brain works and relates to particularly the market culture, which is in its current form, which is very intense, especially in the US, actually has contributed to our insomnia. We'll talk about that.
Okay. I find it actually really fascinating when people come from multiple backgrounds that cross over in a way they didn't expect before. Endocrinology and psychiatry have actually a tremendous amount of crossover, and we're discovering more and more every day how involved that crossover is. But I ask you actually, because again, that's a very unique kind of background, if you could speak a bit about the crossover between our hormonal systems, our neurological systems, and then maybe specifically in regard to sleep and awakeness and your personal take on the topic.
Well, I think the most important thing for your listeners and readership to understand is that the brain has been around for a long, long time. The human brain is just a variation on a very old chassis, if you like. I mean, we are millions of years old in one sense, but in another sense we're extremely young, because the human brain which developed almost as an aberration, is what it is because we have a large cortex, a large frontal cortex, which enables us, as you probably know, and you've talked about before in your program probably, enables us to be extremely clever in our planning and in understanding the social world. We're extremely clever, particularly in the social world. There are no other animals that are able to imagine the sort of stuff that we imagine. However, in thinking that through, we also have to recognize that we are, in our fundamental biology, we are very primitive. A long time ago, the brain recognized, as we grew on this spinning planet, which is very, very important to understand, we adapted habitually and biologically to the night-dark cycle. And you can think of that as a homeostatic mechanism, a balancing mechanism, if you will, and it's what we might call predictive homeostasis. In other words, the brain organizes itself so that even without you consciously being aware of it, it has a different mode of behavior during the dark period than during the light period. So that is a fundamental biology, just in the same way as a fundamental biology of your heart beating 60 times a second or your breathing 20 times a minute. So I think that unless you begin to understand and care for the fact that you have this apparatus inside your head, then, and you're not invincible, you can't do what the hell you please when it comes to sleeping and waking. You have to recognize and be thoughtful about when you sleep and when you wake, and how much you need to sleep and how much you need to wake. Then you're going to screw up your circadian system, and that will make you very unhappy. It's essentially the easy way to think about it is jet lag. In other words, if you deprive yourself of sleep during the day, during the night, by staying up late, and this is what our society does for us at the moment, it pushes the boundary of the way in which we relate to the world, and most Americans are now depriving themselves of about 2 hours sleep a night. And so that means that you've got, just as you might have a deficit in your bank if you spend too much money, on the other hand, if you spend too much time awake, you're going to have a sleep deficit. And if you have a sleep deficit, then you are compounding this problem and you are completely screwing up your predictive homeostasis, this balance of the relationship between your biology and the circadian clock. So that's one of the first important things to remember.
Okay. Now, when we talk about, and you've already mentioned a number of times, when we talk about circadian rhythms, and it's a term that people are aware of. A lot of people refer to them and they appreciate what they are. Is it fair to say that circadian rhythms are more an outgrowth of our brain function, of our endocrinological system, or the combination?
Well, it's a combination, but it's driven by the brain. You know, the brain has a series of clocks in it. All cells have clocks, but basically there's a small part of the hypothalamus, which I call the housekeeping part of the brain, which organizes your brain clocks, and through a series of hormonal relationships will send you to sleep at the usual time in your particular time zone. And you'll wake up again normally, if you're sleeping normally, 7 or 8 hours later. That's the average amount that people sleep. So the brain clocks are what drive all this. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus because it lies over something called the chiasma, which is a word for crossing. It's where the optic nerves cross as they go into the brain, and the chiasmatic nucleus, which is in the hypothalamus, then dictates the clock variable to the rest of the body, partly through direct connection, and partly through the nerves, and partly through the endocrine system. So your endocrine system actually relates very much to your circadian system, and if you were to measure the hormonal shifts that go on through a 24-hour period, you'd find that they too had a rhythm. And the rhythm in steroids, for example, which is something that ties back to our stress levels, they usually drop off towards the end of the day when you go to sleep, and then they start rising again just before you wake up, as if it were preparing you for the day. The thyroid hormone system is the same. So the body gets used to this shifting tide, if you will, of hormonal change, but that's all driven by the brain. So the short answer to your question is it's the brain and the hormonal system working together that keeps you organized, and if you are organized, then you feel well. If you get disorganized, such as even just staying up late one night when you're used to going to bed at 10 o'clock, staying up till 12 or 1, the next morning you feel odd, almost as if you've got a cold coming, and that's because the stress of that creates another hormonal system called cytokine production, which makes you feel as if you have some sort of inflammation, and indeed you do. So that's one of the reasons why anybody who's worried about their sleep, the first thing they have to recognize is that although we're very arrogant as animals, you know, we pretend that we can do anything we like, whenever we like, however we like, we can eat as much as we like, we can sleep as little as we like. It's not true. You have to respect your biology if you want to live a well-tuned life, which is what I talk about in the new book.
So the brain has its clock, as you said. You have the hypothalamic centers that are effectively the body's clocks. Can you manipulate those? Can you reset those? I imagine that when people have jet lag, they are to some extent doing it, but can you reset those clocks so that you can be working on a different time pattern, yet be just as functional, such as people who work a regular basis an overnight shift? Can you reset those clocks?
You can't actually consciously reset your clocks, but they will reset. So in other words, if I say I'm in Los Angeles and I fly to London, yes, so there's an 8-hour shift there, and so that means that my brain, when I get to London, thinks I'm still in Los Angeles, yes, but the light, all this is tied to light. The way in which the brain recognizes the circadian rhythm is through the eyes, and that influences the clock. Because when you wake up, it's light, but if you go to London now and it's morning in Los Angeles, it's actually coming towards dusk in London, and so your brain would not think that it was time to go to sleep, because you have a residual awareness of the Los Angeles time. It takes roughly about an hour shift occurs with each day. You know, one of the beautiful things about crossing the Atlantic, which I used to do on a boat, is that it takes 5 or 6 days, yes? Yeah. So to go from New York to London takes 5 or 6 days, and slowly you accommodate to that because your brain recognizes that things are shifting. But if you do it in a jet engined plane, you arrive there and people are totally confused. And so they're, as you probably have had the experience, you don't think as clearly, you get hungry at the wrong times, your bowels open and close at the wrong times, in terms of wrong being the local sunlight dark cycle, but it's, as far as your brain is concerned, it's the right time, yes? So you will accommodate to that over about a week, but you can't consciously say, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to suddenly work on London time because I want to work on London time. Your biology is much more powerful than that. You can shift it a little bit by tricks. So, for example, when I go to London, what I tend to do is when I get there and I want to go to sleep, I take melatonin. You can buy it in the US in little 3 milligram tablets. You probably know about it and probably talked about it before.
I actually would like you to expand on that because that was one of our questions.
Okay.
Asked us about it, and I definitely would like your opinion on it.
Well, melatonin is produced by the pineal gland, and it's tied into the way in which the brain recognizes the light-dark cycle. So the melatonin begins to rise as evening comes on. And so when you go to sleep, your melatonin is high, and when you wake up, the melatonin shuts off. And it shuts off in part because the light is sensed by the brain. But melatonin itself creates this general body awareness of going to sleep. And so one way you can trick the brain into thinking that it is time to go to sleep is by taking 3 milligrams of melatonin when you get to London, in our example. The other thing you can do is the next morning when you wake up, even though your brain thinks it's evening because it's still on Los Angeles time, if you go outside and walk around or go running or walking, you find that the brain then thinks, it's wake-up time. Mm-hmm. And you can speed the increase the speed at which the brain will accommodate. So instead of it being 7 days, you might be able to do it in 2 or 3 days. Yes. And that is completely harmless, but and the melatonin, in my case anyway, I find that the thinking becomes better faster if you try that. I take it just for 3 days and then I stop. When I come back the other way, I do the opposite. But it's very interesting because the circadian clock, of course, slows down. I mean, if you think about why is that necessary, well, if you think that the brain is constantly accommodating to the seasons, for example, in Los Angeles now, it gets dark in the evening about 8 o'clock. But if I call my friends in Canada, it's still light. And so the brain has to be flexible in terms of its circadian clock. And the way in which it does that is by the clock running a little bit too long. And so you can clip off, you can avoid the circadian, you can decrease the circadian cycle quite easily. And that is important for jet lag because that's why you actually feel better and it's easier, you don't get as much jet lag if you're flying west than if you're flying east. Do you understand that?
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. I find it, the 2 points I wanted to say, I find it fascinating because from an evolutionary point of view, there was no need for our physiology to have the capability to quickly adapt to major changes in time zones because human beings couldn't move that quickly. Exactly. So it's very interesting that literally in the last, less than 100 years, when air travel became common, suddenly our physiologies were introduced to a whole new phenomenon that we had to develop an ability to deal with. The other thing I wanted to ask you was this whole idea of brain clocks and rhythms of the brain. What happens when you change the outside stimuli? For example, you go to Russia and you basically have white nights, or you have the reverse. How do the brain clocks work in conditions like that? And I would, if I may, I'll extend that to situations where you will have people in New York, let's say, but who are working extremely difficult jobs, which are extremely long hours, and they literally do not see daylight, even during the summer. They get in early in the morning, they're in the office the entire day, they leave, it's dark outside, and they have no stimuli as to what's normal and what's not. What happens to the clocks, our internal clocks, under those situations?
Well, they have their own internal rhythm, so they keep going. They're not entirely dependent upon what's called the Zeitgeber, which is the timekeeper, the light that changes. So they do keep going, but they drift slowly. In other words, because they're slightly longer than 24 hours, they slowly drift away. So if you, for example, put somebody in a cave and they didn't have any time cues whatsoever, they would slowly, because their cycle is more than 24 hours, they would slowly drift so that their sleep-wake cycle would be asynchronous with what is going on outside that they don't know about. And that's partly what happens to people who, as you describe, are working shift work and so on. The other thing that your listeners may be interested in is that the way in which the brain perceives light is actually not as simple as it might seem on the surface. Most electric light, for example, especially in a house, a normal 60 or 100 watt bulb, the brain doesn't really recognize that as a bright light. So it's a bit like living in a cave in the evening. And so that's the other thing that people don't realize. Although we think we've extended our daylight by using electricity, in fact, the brain has already decided that it's dark when you're sitting there. But there is an interesting twist with our modern technology, which is that the brain is more sensitive to blue light than it is to orange light. And so if you sit in front of a computer screen late at night and you're busy playing with the web or doing your email or something, and if you do that for a couple of hours before you try to go to sleep, the brain has been tricked again into thinking that it's not quite ready for sleep yet. And so this is how many people actually create their own insomnia by playing with the technological tools late at night. And it's a much better idea to do something ancient, like read a book, if you have to do something in the late evening, or listen to music, rather than playing with your computer, unless you get one of these screens, which is a sort of an orange cover for the monitor, so that you can then the brain then thinks, oh well, it's time to go to sleep. So the circadian, I think the bottom line message is that you have to be respectful of the circadian activity of your brain, because otherwise you will screw up your sleep-wake cycle, and once you get it screwed up, it's very difficult to get it back on track again. And so the idea, well, I can't sleep, therefore I'm going to take a pill, once you started getting into that cycle, you're in real trouble. And the average person in America does take about 2 hours out of every day that they should be sleeping, and they try to catch up at the weekends. And in American Mania, that second book that you mentioned, I have a whole chapter on the way in which time messes up our clocks. It's but in general, my sense is that if you understand the physiology and you respect yourself as not only one of these invincible human beings that we think we are, but also an ordinary animal that has lived on this spinning planet for millions of years, then you become much more humble and aware of how you can take care of yourself.
In a totally anecdotal way, I just find it interesting. I remember when I would be on call during the surgical part of my residencies, that I would find, like everybody else, I would find, the 36-hour shifts very difficult. But when I was doing my computer training, and I was sitting at the computer at 12 o'clock at night, very often I felt awake, and I could work for 36 hours straight, and admittedly with a large bottle of cola and next to me, but it was a very different experience trying to stay awake in front of a computer screen versus trying to stay awake in front of a patient. And again, totally anecdotal, of course, but I wonder now in retrospect if it was that blue light effect that actually helped. I find it absolutely
probably is, and the coffee, of course, also. Coffee is very interesting because caffeine is one of the only drugs we know that actually increases your ability to stay awake without actually changing your performance too much. I mean, you can stay awake with amphetamines, and a lot of people use that and abuse those drugs now when they're in this work cycle that you were talking about. That is very dangerous. Caffeine is less dangerous, although it's still addictive. And if you take a big Starbucks cup of coffee, which has 700 milligrams of caffeine in it, you can be wired for quite a long time. That's another reason why, if you're sensitive to it, you should not be drinking coffee after noon, basically, because otherwise you'll keep yourself awake. And again, it's just a matter, as you know, if you're a surgeon. I was a surgeon too for a while before I became an endocrinologist, before I became a psychiatrist. I used to find that I developed some tricks there too. I would stay up most of the night because I was working, and when I went to bed, I had learned that if I took a warm bath before I went to bed, I would sleep better. And so there's another example of how you sort of lull the body into thinking, well, things are going to be fine. But I think you and I probably see it the same way. The most important thing is to recognize that the body has its own autonomy, and you can't will yourself to be something that you're not. And so we've learned how to cope with this spinning planet, but we can't ignore that we still live on a spinning planet and we're still biological creatures.
You mentioned caffeine, and then you mentioned other stimulants. Unfortunately, medications like Adderall get passed around. It's a well-known phenomenon these days, get passed around high schools and universities and elsewhere so that students can, cram in all they need to do in the last couple of weeks of the semester. I'd like to ask, again, going back to the brain's clock, internal clock, do those medications, they obviously have an effect, but do they have long-term effects? If people are taking these medications long-term, because, again, a lot of people do crazy things in order to deal with their life issues, deal with their work responsibilities. If people are taking these medications for a long time, or they really are living on caffeine endlessly for a long time, can that permanently change the chemistry in the brain's internal clocks?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, they have various addictive potentials, of course. Some of them are more addictive than others, but what they do is they shift the clock in a way that is powerful, and when the clock is shifted, it takes a long time to accommodate back again. Right. Plus the fact most of these drugs have other side effects. They're not, and therefore withdrawing from them, withdrawing from caffeine, people very often have headaches. They drink a lot of coffee. This used to happen to me. I would drink coffee all day long as a sort of habitual cultural thing at work, and then you go home at the weekend, you don't drink as much, and suddenly you find you have a headache, and you wonder why. Well, it's partly because you're withdrawing from the caffeine, and the same thing is true of individuals who have crazy work schedules. They find that when they're not on the amphetamines, they crash, or they feel actually very sweaty and unable to do what they did before, because, again, it's a mild withdrawal from the drugs they're taking. All of this really speaks to the fact that we've invented a world now, a market-driven culture, which derives from the idea that you have to do everything quickly and you have to do it 24/7. And if you do that, then you end up with a set of circumstances where you are driving your physiology, again, in a way that is tied to your livelihood. And then you get yourself into a box which you can't get out of, because you have to go to work. It's what I call the fast new world, which is essentially fostered by the idea that if I work harder and earn more money, and then I can have the things I want, etc., etc. But in the process of doing that, as I mentioned earlier, as you take on a debt financially, you can take on a debt physiologically. And if you take on too much debt physiologically, you then begin to damage yourself. For example, there's an interesting correlation, which I'm sure you've talked about on your program before, between how much you eat and how much you sleep. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, it's inverse. So the less you sleep, the more you eat. And again, you may have noticed this on when you were practicing surgery, which is if you stay up all night, the next morning you're ravenously hungry, and you could eat a ham and a couple of eggs and a few stacks of pancakes, and that's another example, because hormonal shifts occur when you deprive people of sleep. There's something called leptin and ghrelin, which you may have come across. The leptin tends to reduce appetite, ghrelin increases it, and what happens is when you get into that cycle, you actually change the way in which your body works, and you end up gaining weight. So that if you ask people how much do they sleep, and some studies that have been done have looked at over 1 million people, and they find that there's this high correlation between how much you weigh and how little you sleep. And if you then go to subsets of those individuals and you look at their EEG patterns, which gives you a better index of what the brain is actually doing, indeed you find that the reduction in sleep, and particularly the reduction in deep sleep, tends to correlate with rising weight. And as you know, the country has a huge problem with not just being a little overweight, but being morbidly obese. Something like 35% of us now are morbidly obese, 60% of us are overweight. We're one of the fattest nations in the world. So in fact, what you're doing not only is changing the weight, but your sleep cycle is driving that weight change.
Fascinating. You actually mentioned the term "a fast new world." When you said that, I thought of the quote from the movie Wall Street,
Yes.
where the Michael Douglas character says to the Charlie Sheen character, "Money never sleeps," and
Right.
that we're now in a reality where someone is awake somewhere in the world right now doing work that you need to be involved with. And that's such a difficult thing to, you can't ignore that. There are certain kinds of work where you simply can't ignore that reality, and these people are in an impossible situation where they can never really get a night's sleep. They just can't get a night's sleep properly. So I can only imagine what that does to them. If I may, I'm going to ask you one more pharmacological question. Oh, I'm sorry, please, comment.
I was going to say, we basically, simplistically put, we've traded time for money. Yes. And
Right.
the source of new time is the 8 hours that people should sleep. And so if they're not reverent about the fact that sleep is important, then they take from their sleep bank because they want to make more money. And it's a crazy circle. It can only end in disaster.
Right. I understand. I wanted to ask you one more pharmacological question, because this has been absolutely fascinating, the crossover. When you take a medication that helps you sleep, and I'm talking about anything from a benzodiazepine to some of the other more recent medications, is it working on the same internal clock and having also an effect on the endocrinological system, or is that a totally different pathway?
Well, when you talk about benzodiazepines, it's working on a different pathway. I mean, it reduces the awareness of the individual to stressful events in their environment. So many people who take benzodiazepines, or many people who can't sleep, initially find that they're anxious when they during the day, and they get anxious at night, and then when because their mind is spinning very rapidly, and in that process they try to calm themselves down. And some people drink alcohol, which is also a bad idea because it screws up your slow wave sleep to go to sleep. They will go to sleep if they drink enough alcohol for a little while, but they'll wake up in the middle of the night feeling even worse than they did. But benzodiazepines have the same effect, because they're very similar to alcohol in the way they work. But the problem is that as you increase the dose, because they are addictive, you have to take more and more and more of it. So people start by taking, most of the hypnotics are in this category, and so if you take more of them, you find that as you begin to escalate the dose, you need an escalating dose just to sleep the little bit that you were sleeping. And so again, you get into a vicious cycle, this disturbs the circadian clock because you're not sleeping very much, and the clock then gets confused about whether it's night or day, etc., etc., and you come back to the same problem as we were talking about earlier. So one of the interesting things to me is that in the modern world now, we essentially tether ourselves to machines that drive our behavior around the clock. As you said earlier, distance has essentially disappeared. You're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast, yes? And so the way in which you and I can talk to each other through this mechanism, this internet mechanism, is essentially removes time as a consideration, but it doesn't remove it from inside our heads. And so the idea that, again, we're invincible and we can do whatever we like, whenever we like. So the combination of technology, of opportunities to eat whenever you please, to sleep whenever you please, to fly wherever you want to go, it's completely screwed up the usual constraints that occur on human behavior. And the market system drives that, because what drives the market is our curiosity and our self-interest. But what holds the market back is our social relationships. But our social relationships have become fragmented in the same way as our sleep-wake cycle, because most of us do not spend a great deal of time with other people now, except through the technology that we're working with.
Right. What I think is an incredibly important point, and one which I would say from my own experiences many doctors don't appreciate, is that you are playing with totally different mechanisms. It's not as if we have control on the hypothalamic clock so that we can give one medication that resets it and then give another medication to bring it down so we can sleep. What we're doing is we're aberrating it in one way using one type of medication, and then aberrating it in a totally different way with a different kind of medication. And none of this is natural. None of this is physiological. And the end result is you might manage to get some sleep when you need it, and you might manage to be up for that critical presentation, but you're paying a tremendous cost in terms of your health when you're doing this, especially if you're doing it on a prolonged basis. Is that a fair statement?
No, I agree, absolutely, yes.
And if I can ask you a personal perspective, I mean, again, accepting the fact that there are tremendous stressors in life and people want to be in an optimal situation, but the medications that are sold to keep people awake and then to help them sleep, I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And my question to you is, do you get a sense that people appreciate that this isn't good, that we shouldn't be living this way? Or do they come to you and say, what's the big deal? And I'll sleep? Because if we don't get people to understand that they really should not be manipulating themselves with these drugs, then there's no hope of ever getting people back on a natural path. So I'm curious what your personal impression is. Is it a big deal? I'll just take sleeping pills, I'll just take wake-up pills? Or do you get the sense that people are coming to you and saying, I want a different way to live my life. Help me do it without drugs. Help me do it another way.
Well, I think that's a laudable goal, and I think some people do have that goal, but they're in the minority. I mean, one of the interesting things about our culture is that we now, pharmaceutical companies market directly to the individual. They don't go even through the doctor anymore. So you can watch the television and decide if you want to be sexually potent, you can buy a pill for that. If you want to be asleep, you can buy a pill for that. If you've got a painful joint, you can buy a pill for that. Or you can get your doctor to prescribe it for you. So there's an enormous pressure in the other direction. So somebody who says, I want to get back to living a life where I enjoy myself and it's optimal. There are not only the pressures of the economy, because the way the economy is built right now, as we know, there's some group of people who are doing extremely well, and another group of people which is very large, who are having trouble making the daily rent. I think that if you put all that together, and then you create this opportunity for people to somehow manipulate themselves, in theory at least, to manage this crazy lifestyle, then you've got a huge population that is damaging themselves. And if you look at the statistics, anxiety and depression is going up, especially in young people. The sale of antidepressants is now highest in individuals who are between the ages of 18 and 45. So the general sense of progress in our society has gone off the rails. So I must ask yourself, in what form are we progressing? Well, we're certainly progressing technologically, but is that a progress that you can tie back to human progress? And that's really what the new book is about, the well-tuned brain, neuroscience, and the life well lived, because it takes all these elements and tries to put them together. So we're running out of time. I have something else at 9 o'clock my time.
You're too interesting.
Pardon?
Your fault to keep this going. If I can ask you one more question?
Sure.
Okay. I know that I've been reading recent articles about the effect of affluence on sleep. And I recently read that it's actually people who are less affluent who are getting more sleep, which is contrary to what people intuitively would think. And I wanted to ask your opinion on that, and perhaps your sense of an explanation for that.
Well, I think that, as Shakespeare said, you know, we live best in the mean. In other words, this is coming back to balancing your life. The metaphor of the new book, The Well-Tuned Brain, is taken from J.S. Bach, the well-tempered clavier, you know, which was an idea that in those days, he was writing in the 18th century, you had to tune your piano, then called a clavier, because it kept on going out of tune with the different weather patterns and so on and so forth. So if you think about that, the way in which J.S. Bach became such a brilliant musician was he learned how to play his instrument, and he trained himself to play his instrument extremely well as to tune it extremely well. If you use that metaphor, then each of us has this extraordinary instrument inside our heads called the brain, yes? And if we get to understand it, then we can do something about it. Now, I think that if you're trying to create balance, both poverty, severe poverty, or anxiety and stress related to when is my next dollar coming from, and also affluence are both actually destructive elements. So you find that children of really affluent families have actually more difficulty with drugs and anxiety and so on than do children who are poor, not dirt poor, but poorer. So it's the balance in the middle that makes the difference. And so it's not surprising to me what you describe, that affluence itself and poverty, it's a U-shaped curve. If you're poverty-stricken or you're affluent, you are in bad shape. If you're in the middle, then you live a more balanced life, and that I think is probably reflected in the fact that you described that most people who live in the middle, they sleep a little better and they probably have a more comfortable existence. The trouble is that we're driving them continuously in a way that is probably unhealthy. Our whole society has to begin to think about what it is that we're trying to do here. What is progress? What is human progress? I sense the first chapter of the first sentence of the new book is, we live now in the shadow of our achievements, and a lot of what you're describing are created by our achievements. Sleep-wake cycle would not be a problem if we didn't have all this fascinating stuff to play with all the time, yes?
So I'm going to end with a somewhat summarizing question in 30 seconds. What's the future of sleep in the next 20 years?
It's absolutely vital. If you want to live a comfortable life, you should be sleeping 7 or 8 hours a night, and you should be going to sleep at the same time and waking up at the same time, and you should not be, reading in bed. You should not be watching the television. You should keep the bedroom for going to sleep. And if you do that, you will feel a lot better, and you will have a much better life, because sleep is absolutely essential to human beings. The idea that some students have when they're young, that they will cram the night before and they will do better in their examination, there is absolutely concrete evidence that that is a crazy way to ace an exam. What you should do is you can study hard until, say, 48 hours before, to put the books away, make sure you have plenty of sleep, and you'll do much better in the exam. So sleep, the future of sleep, if we are going to respect it, is very strong, and we will eventually be benefited by the fact if we all sleep a little more. And we'll also be thinner, by the way.
Okay. That is brilliant. I cannot thank you enough. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I mean, the books sound absolutely fascinating as well. I want to thank you for your time. Our audience thanks you for your time.
Pleasure.
And I really wish you all the best.
Thank you, and good luck with your program. Sounds very important for the public health.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. Bye-bye.
Okay. I'm just going to say one last word to our audience that this video will be available very soon. We post our videos online. We can be followed on Facebook and on Twitter. We have our general audience, and I want to wish everybody a wonderful day, and to all a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Again.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
However, in thinking that through, we also have to recognize that we are, in our fundamental biology, we are very primitive. A long time ago, the brain recognized, as we grew on this spinning planet, which is very, very important to understand, we adapted habitually and biologically to the night-dark cycle. And you can think of that as a homeostatic mechanism, a balancing mechanism, if you will, and it's what we might call predictive homeostasis. In other words, the brain organizes itself so that even without you consciously being aware of it, it has a different mode of behavior during the dark period than during the light period. So that is a fundamental biology, just in the same way as a fundamental biology of your heart beating 60 times a second, or your breathing 20 times a minute. So I think that unless you begin to understand and care for the fact that you...
Los Angeles. He was born and educated in England. He's the author of, among other books, A Mood Apart and the award-winning American Mania, When More Is Not Enough. We're going to be talking about a whole range of topics, but before I proceed, I would like to turn to Dr. Whybrow and ask him to introduce himself to our audience.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you.
You're quite right. I'm at the University of California. I migrated here from England years ago, and now I direct what is probably the largest neuroscience and behavior program in the US. And we have all sorts of experts here. I just reflect what I know from those wonderful people who work with me. But my interest has been for a long time. I'm an endocrinologist originally, before I became a psychiatrist. And I've always been interested in bodily rhythms. And of course, many of these rhythms go wrong in serious illnesses like depression and mania, which is the book that you mentioned, A Mood Apart. American Mania was a book published about 7 or 8 years ago, which described some of the difficulties that we have in America.
That's a very unique kind of background. If you could speak a bit about the crossover between our hormonal systems, our neurological systems, and then maybe specifically in regard to sleep and awakeness, and your personal take on the topic.
Well, I think the most important thing for your listeners and readership to understand is that the brain, has been around for a long, long time. The human brain is just a variation on a very old chassis, if you like. I mean, we are millions of years old in one sense, but in another sense we're extremely young, because the human brain, which developed almost as an aberration, is what it is because we have a large cortex, a large frontal cortex, which enables us, as you probably know, and you've talked about before in your program probably, enables us to be extremely clever in our planning and in understanding the social world. We're extremely clever, particularly in the social world. There are no other animals that are able to imagine the sort of stuff that we imagine in society because of our extraordinary, fast new world that we've created, which is extremely enticing but also very damaging in terms of our bodily processes and also in terms of the way we think. And most recently, just this week, which I think is how you came to know about me, a new book called The Well-Tuned Brain has just arrived on the stands. I think it's May 14th, its actual publication date, but so that is a book that talks about how one can be a little kinder to oneself and understand the way the brain works and relates to particularly the market culture, which is in its current form, which is very intense, especially in the US, actually has contributed to our insomnia. We'll talk about that.
Okay. I find it actually really fascinating when people come from multiple backgrounds that cross over in a way they didn't expect before. Endocrinology and psychiatry have actually a tremendous amount of crossover, and we're discovering more and more every day how involved that crossover is. But I ask you actually because, again, okay. Well, welcome to everyone. My name is Dr. Nachum Kowalski, and I want to welcome you to the Sleep ASAP webinar. Hopefully you're one of the many people who's returning to watch us once again to speak with a top-level expert in the area of sleep. Before we start, I would like to introduce Sleep ASAP. Sleep ASAP is a new global sleep management education platform established by an international team of specialists in different fields such as art therapy, music therapy, psychology, and neurology. Now, we've gathered in order to promote awareness and discuss effective and affordable alternate solutions beyond medications for people with sleep issues. So whether you yourself have sleep issues, or you work in the field, or maybe you're a student studying this field, or you just basically want to learn about the topic, this webinar really is for you. Now today, we really do have the honor of being able to host Dr. Peter C. Whybrow on the topic of the brain's clocks, sleep, and the rhythms of the brain. Dr. Wybrow, MD, is a director of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at the University of California.